This one's all voice.
Committee will come back to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 2126, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. The chair would recognize Mr. McKinley, a co-author of the bill, for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. But I don't. Here he is, right here. I was looking for you on my right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that Peter Welch and I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2126, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia and Mr. Welch of Vermont.
So without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that Peter Welch and I are offering today primarily deals with some technical changes. We worked with the chairman, ranking member Waxman's staff, as well as the GSA, the EPA, and the Department of Energy on this matter. The bill has been thoroughly vetted and is supported by hundreds of companies and organizations, including manufacturers, real estate companies, and environmental advocates. But on this, on the issue of energy efficiency, one couldn't have a better ally in the House than Peter Welch. He truly is a national leader when it comes to energy efficiency and has been an outspoken advocate for numbers of years. Therefore, I'd like to thank him and his staff for their hard work on this bill, and we look forward to continuing our working relationship together. We hope this legislation passes the House expeditiously, without objection, and is ultimately to the Senate. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Did you want to yield time to Mr. Welch? No? No? Gentleman yields back?
Oh,
Mr. Welch.
thank you. No, I want to thank you, Mr. McKinley, and I want to thank Mr. Upton and Mr. Waxman and Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Rush. It's nice to be getting something done, and maybe we could get used to it. So thank you.
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I yield to Mr. Waxman.
Whoever has the time. I think McKinley has the time. I just want to quickly thank Mr. McKinley, Mr. Welch, and Chairman Upton for working with us to make a number of bipartisan improvements in the bill with the amendment that's going to be offered by Mr. Welch. The bill has broad stakeholder support, deserves the support of this committee, and I hope we'll all work together to build on the success of this effort.
Gentleman yields back his time. Are there amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2126, offered by Mr. McNerney.
And the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment to the...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to congratulate Mr. Welch, Mr. McKinley, and all the others for their hard work in this very important area. Section 2 of the bill directs the General Services Administration to work with the Department of Energy to develop best practices to encourage commercial building owners and tenants to invest in cost-effective energy efficiency measures. My amendment simply adds cost-effective water efficiency measures to this section. Our nation's water and energy infrastructure is linked together. It's critical that we work to identify opportunities to become more efficient in both of these areas, and having the GSA lead by example is a good step in the right direction. I'm sure that many of this committee members know how dry years affect their constituents. Devastating droughts hit the Midwest last year, affecting water and energy prices, agricultural production, and access to critical resources. Similar problems are occurring in the West this year, particularly California, which is enduring its driest year on record. Addressing water use requires a comprehensive approach with state and local municipalities, residents, businesses, farmers, and ranchers all doing their part. Even in normal years, some areas of California find it difficult to meet demands for water. The state population continues to grow, with 60 million Californians expected by 2050, meaning more families, farms, and businesses will rely on regional water supplies for their daily needs. Water is truly a precious commodity, and improving water conservation now will pay big dividends in years to come. Water efficiency is not a silver bullet, but it's an important component of a larger effort to make our water stretch further. Making energy efficient and water smart choices will benefit everyone in the long run, creating jobs, ensuring our resources go farther, saving money, and encouraging innovation. Again, I want to thank the bill's authors, Mr. McKinley and Mr. Welch, for their advocacy on energy efficiency. And I'm very glad that this legislation is moving forward, especially in a bipartisan way. I encourage the adoption of my amendment, I think, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others wishing to speak on the McNerney amendment? See, a gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Mr. McNerney's amendment as the General Services Administration develops model commercial leasing provisions and best practices to facilitate investments in energy efficiency. It makes sense for GSA to address water efficiency at the same time. I think this is a common sense amendment, and I hope all members will support it.
If the gentleman will yield, I want to appreciate Mr. McNerney's working with both sides of the aisle, and our side certainly supports this as an improvement to the bill and would like to see it included. So I yield back. Are there other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the McNerney amendment to the McKinley-Welch amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The vote now occurs on the McKinley-Welch amendment as amended by the McNerney amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The vote now moves to final passage of the bill. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote now occurs on final passage of the bill as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the bill as amended is approved. The chair now calls up H.R. 3826 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3826, to provide direction to the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency regarding the establishment of standards for emissions of any greenhouse gas from fossil fuel-fired electric utility generating units and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any other amendments to the bill? The chair would recognize the gentleman from California. For what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3826, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
And the amendment is considered as read by unanimous consent, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since November, I have asked Republicans, if you don't like EPA's approach, what's your plan for dealing with climate change? The bill we're considering today shows that the Republicans' plan is to give up hope, to let our children and grandchildren suffer the effects of climate change without lifting a finger to protect them. Worse, the Republicans' plan is to stop any meaningful action to slow climate change. I think this position is indefensible. Today's bill would amend the Clean Air Act to ensure that coal-fired power plants are able to pollute indefinitely with impunity. This bill would condition EPA's authority on conditions that will simply never be met, at least not as long as it is cheaper to dump pollution into the air rather than clean it up. Under this bill, EPA could not require new power plants to control their pollution until 6 power plants in different parts of the country voluntarily install pollution controls. That's just not what for-profit enterprises do, and this bill would create a further disincentive for such voluntary actions. This bill would also bar EPA from requiring existing power plants to control their pollution until Congress passes a new law. I understand that some don't like EPA's approach. The Congress did pass the law. It's called the Clean Air Act. It delegated to the EPA the power to set standards, to approach health-based goals for reductions of pollutants. Carbon has been found to be a pollutant that must be regulated under the findings of the EPA. The bill would take that away from EPA and say, oh, no, you can't. You can't regulate for new power plants. You can't regulate for existing power plants. So if you don't like this approach, what's the alternative? For years now, I've said to Chairman Upton that I'm willing to consider any suggestion that will reduce carbon pollution and slow climate change. I proposed a market-based cap-and-trade approach. I proposed a carbon tax approach. I support regulatory approaches, whether market-based or performance standards. I strongly support international action. I support more funding for research, demonstration, and deployment of clean energy technologies. In the Waxman-Markey bill, we dedicated $60 billion to deploy carbon capture and sequestration technology on new coal plants. I support state actions. I support education programs and incentives for voluntary actions by individuals and businesses. But what Congress can't do is say no to every possible means of slowing dangerous climate change. And that's all my amendment addresses. It does not change how this bill would limit EPA's authority to address carbon pollution from coal-fired power plants. My amendment simply says that those limits on EPA's authority only apply once there is an alternative approach to replace the EPA rules that is at least as effective in reducing carbon pollution. My message for my Republican colleagues is if you don't like EPA's approach, propose your own plan. Just don't say no to everything. We've seen Republicans say no to a lot of things over the past few years. No Affordable Care Act, no DREAM Act, no Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, no EPA pollution controls. What we don't see from the Republicans are any plans to address the real problems that are hurting the American people. No plan for people who can't get health insurance. No plan for jobs beyond 35 permanent jobs they claim would come from the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. No plan to avoid deporting people who are brought here as children and raised as Americans. No plan to protect consumers from the predatory lending practices that drove our economy to the brink. No plan to avert another catastrophe like the chemical spill and water contamination in West Virginia. And, of course, pertinent to today, no plan for climate change. I hope my colleagues will join me in recognizing that climate change is real and urgent, and I hope you will support my amendment to make it clear that no plan and no action isn't an option. And so I would urge support for this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much, and I rise to speak in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. I would say that this legislation has been brought to the committee, and we hope to get it to the floor because it's quite clear that this administration is becoming very extreme in its views on CO2 emissions. And they're moving in directions that they've never tried to move in before. First of all, Section 111 clearly states that the technology must be adequately demonstrated in setting these emission standards. As a matter of fact, the plants that EPA is identifying as setting their emission standards, we believe clearly violates the 2005 Energy Policy Act when it talks about not using plants that are using federal funds for demonstration projects. We've sent letters to EPA and asked them about this, and they are not replying in any way. For the first time ever under Section 111, they want to go to a system-based approach rather than a source approach. So this EPA is stepping outside the bounds of the legal authority of the existing Clean Air Act. Our legislation, which we believe is a prerogative of Congress, is to simply set the guidelines specifically so that EPA can regulate greenhouse gases. We're not trying to deny that. But in doing so, they have to use technology that has been adequately demonstrated. And we are more specific in defining that definition than what is in the existing Clean Air Act, because EPA has already decided that they're not going to enforce the act the way we interpret it, that it should be enforced. And then on top of that, I might say, in addition to violating the Energy Policy Act of 2005, in addition to violating the adequately demonstrated language of 111, in addition to going to a system-based approach instead of an individual source approach, this entire concept is based upon a unilateral decision by President Obama when he went to Copenhagen and set the emission standards that the U.S. would follow. It is not a federal law. Congress was never a part of that. And that's another reason we've introduced this legislation, because there hasn't even been a federal debate about the president trying to move us down the road that the Europeans have followed. And now we see in recent news articles that the Europeans are backing up because they are building new coal-powered plants because their natural gas coming out of Russia is so high. So this legislation simply gives us an option in the future, if natural gas prices go up, that coal can be used to build a new coal-powered plant. And now we all have great respect and admiration for the gentleman from California, who's is very sincere in his efforts, but now he is saying that EPA can keep doing what it's doing until the EIA certifies there's an alternative federal program that achieves the same CO2 emissions. And I might say, our CO2 emissions are lower than they've been in 20 years. We in America don't have to take a back seat to anyone on protecting our clean air, and we're doing better than any other place in the world. So I think this legislation is a reasonable approach, and I would respectfully request that we not put an additional burden by adopting the Waxman Amendment, and would therefore oppose the Waxman Amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support Mr. Waxman's amendment. This amendment says that this bill can block EPA action on carbon pollution from coal-fired power plants, but only if we're getting comparable pollution reductions another way, and I think that's completely reasonable. We know that ignoring climate change, doing nothing at all about carbon pollution, would be deeply irresponsible. Carbon pollution continues to rise rapidly. Climate change will impose huge costs, and we have only years, not decades, to avert catastrophe. Final and draft portions of the upcoming IPCC Fifth Assessment Report on climate change sound the alarm with even greater urgency than before. The chilling future it paints isn't some hypothetical worst-case scenario. It's where we're going full speed ahead unless we sharply reduce carbon pollution now. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are substantially higher than they have been for the past 800,000 years, and they're rising at a rate that is unprecedented over the past 22,000 years at least. The IPCC found that we're already experiencing warmer and more frequent hot days, more heat waves, more and heavier big rainstorms, drier and longer droughts, and more extreme high sea levels. In 2012, the World Bank released a report on the potential effects of increasing average temperatures by 4 degrees Celsius or 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, and this is well within the range of possibility if we don't act. The impacts of this level of warming would be devastating. Sea levels would be over 3 feet higher, inundating coastal cities. Losses from high-intensity storms could double, with North America experiencing some of the worst impacts. Extreme heat waves could become the new normal summer. And is that the world we want to leave our children and grandchildren? And if not, what are we going to do about it? I strongly support EPA's reasonable proposal for requiring new coal plants to use the best pollution controls. There's no excuse for investing billions of dollars in a plant that will run for half a century or more, but not using available pollution controls. The history of the Clean Air Act shows that when we require industry to control pollution, technological advances and economies of scale drive down the costs and improve the effectiveness of pollution controls. And we've seen this over and over again, Mr. Chairman. And EPA hasn't even issued a proposal to address existing plants. This bill would block EPA from reducing carbon pollution from existing plants before we've even seen what they might require. That's declaring defeat before the starting bell. And I believe we can take steps to reduce carbon pollution, and I believe that EPA will come up with a reasonable and cost-effective approach. But if you don't want to rely on EPA's current rulemaking, this amendment leaves other options open. Mr. Waxman's amendment says the only thing we can't do is nothing. And so I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I'd ask my colleagues not to support this amendment. If you're from the Midwest and you want to talk about jobs, we have tons of jobs in the coal mining fields that are closing. We have hundreds of jobs in the utility sector, in the power plants across our country closing. Chairman Whitfield was right when he said, and to my colleague from New Jersey, what we found out in the hearings is the technology available based upon what is known today is not economically feasible. And so the power plant in Mississippi is $2 billion over budget right now, with hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars going to help it prove economic feasibility. So the part of this whole debate is that it's economically feasible not to do it. So the default is shut down the coal plants. That's the default position right now if we continue to move forward on this EPA's position, because it's not economically feasible. And I'll talk to the people who believe in carbon capture and sequestration. In the state of Illinois, we have mineral rights laws. So if you have, when you own the property, you own from the surface down to all the minerals that are on that property. What happens when you're from states that have minerals, you can split those off. States haven't even started talking about how are they going to compensate the landowner from sequestering carbon underneath their property. There is legal issues that are going to take years to get resolved. In fact, when FutureGen was being competitively bid out in the state of Texas and the state of Illinois, those states had to pass liability protection laws for the carbon capture and sequestration position of the FutureGen fight. So for people to believe that we are eminently close to being able to do what our friends on the left would like us to do, we're not even close. We're not close technologically, we're not close legally, and we're not close financially. So again, the default position would be shut down the coal mines, shut down the power plants, raise electricity rates, because green power is more expensive power. So you're talking about jobs in the coal mines, jobs in the power plants, and then you're talking about a risk to whatever manufacturing base that we're now redeveloping because electricity rates are going up. So I would just plead with my colleagues to go down that path to less jobs. Let's go down the path to keep the good paying jobs that we have and move to a future of a competitive environment where we can continue to create jobs in this weak economy. And you do that through the foundational principles of low-cost energy. No one can show me where jobs grow when energy costs are high. You just can't show me. It has to be subsidized. You cannot. Low-cost energy creates jobs across our economy and really across the world. And so let's don't stop the path. Let's move on this bill. I'd ask my colleagues to defeat the Waxman amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get back to some of the things that our colleague, Mr. Whitfield, spoke to a few moments ago on the whole issue of greenhouse gas emissions and that they are falling in the United States. It was suggested that the United States doesn't need to do anything more about climate change. And I think that this is really wrong-headed. And if we buy into that concept, that this is a march to folly. U.S. greenhouse gas emissions did fall in 2008 and 2009 during the economic recession. But since that time, our overall emissions have grown. Cumulatively, U.S. emissions grew, they didn't fall. In 2010 and 2011, the two most recent years for which the data is available. Claims that emissions are falling are looking only at the energy sector, where fuel switching from coal to natural gas in electricity generation has helped control emissions somewhat. And even these claims are no longer accurate. Recently, the Energy Information Administration reported that energy-related carbon dioxide emissions last year grew by 2% as a result of fuel switching in the other direction, from natural gas back to coal. The EIA projects that under current policy, carbon dioxide emissions will continue to increase over the coming decades. I don't know how many of you saw a recent picture in the New York Times. It was on the front page above the fold. And they were Chinese workers in Beijing, and they couldn't see a foot in front of them. It looked like someone had produced a cloud machine, as if they were on a stage, and that there was smoke or clouds around them. So this isn't anything to fool around with. And I think that these numbers and these statistics are ringing an alarm bell. I think what matters most is whether U.S. emissions are on track to decline in the future by the amount needed to prevent dangerous climate change. Scientists say we need to reduce carbon pollution by 80% by 2050 to avoid catastrophic climate change. I don't think we're going to get anywhere near that level of reduction if we just continue business as usual or take numbers and suggest that all is well. If there's any country that can do this and be a leader in the world, it's the United States of America. We have the technology, we have the capacity. All we have to have is the will, the political will to place our country on the right path. And I don't agree that in taking this path that you sacrifice our economy or jobs. I think that that's a straw man. I really don't. So I have a minute 35 seconds. I'm happy to yield to Mr. Waxman.
Thank you for yielding to me. I just want to respond to the statement made by my friend from Illinois about how, if we're going to protect jobs, we should make sure that we're not going to spend any more money on energy. The history of the Clean Air Act is our economy has grown, even though we put in anti-pollution efforts, some of which required spending, whether it's catalytic converters on cars or scrubbers on power plant, whatever changes even greater efficiency in the use of energy. These things have helped our economy grow. Secondly, he argues that cheap energy keeps jobs. Well, energy is cheap from coal-burning power plants, unless, of course, they can't compete against natural gas in the market. But the energy is cheaper because we're subsidizing coal. When burning coal causes diseases from the pollutants that result from the burning of coal, the harm for that is paid for by the medical costs, the loss of job work when people can't show up at work, the poor health that results from air pollution, especially in a region. But we're looking at another harm from air pollution from coal-burning power plants, and that's the global climate change problem. And in the news right now, as it is, seems to be every day, we're hearing about the enormous costs that we pay for not dealing with this global climate catastrophe that we're facing. So low costs for coal is coming as a result of greater pollution costs to all of us, and our economy would grow and more jobs would be created if we required the industries to be developed to control that pollution, whether it be the development of sequestration of carbon or some other way to have that happen. Mr. Chairman, just to complete my thought, all the amendment does is says that this bill would not go into effect if we have another solution that would achieve the same reductions. And if you don't want this approach, give us another approach that will hold down the reductions of carbon, and then we will know we're doing something about the climate change problem. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And just in response, obviously I'm opposed to the amendment, but in response to the gentlelady's comments that the jobs issue was a straw man, they may have just concluded it, but this morning, starting at 10:30, a group of Virginia legislators held a press conference in relationship to a letter they have signed by 85 members of that body that they are sending to the President opposing the proposed regulations that we're speaking of here today as well. And as a part of that, I think it's important that we acknowledge that many folks think that this is important and related to jobs. And I quote, "We think it is important that President Obama understands how important the coal industry is to Virginia's economy and how harmful these proposed regulations will be for Virginia if they are put in place," said Senator Phil Puckett, Democrat, Russell County. Continuing the quote, "More than 45,000 Virginians work in the coal industry and their livelihood is at stake." Puckett continued, "They deserve to have their voices heard." Ladies and gentlemen, I will be voting no because they do deserve to have their voices heard, and their congressman in Washington understands that this is about jobs. We are not going to become like China. We're not going to have such poor regulations that we all have to wear masks over our faces. That is not the issue here. The issue is we've done some good things in making sure our air is clean, but the EPA can never be satisfied. They always want to go one step further, and in this case, they're killing an industry with no gain to the American people as I can see it. And while we may want to solve some worldwide problem down the road, we're not going to solve it if the Chinese are still having to wear masks over their face because they're breathing and putting into the air all of their chemicals. That's the same air that we breathe a few days later. And so, you know, this is a problem that maybe we need to worry about our foreign policy and what we deal with, how we deal with other nations. But when it comes to our nation, we've done a good job. We should continue to do that good job, but we shouldn't kill up to 45,000 jobs in the state of Virginia because we want to tilt at the windmill.
Would the gentleman yield? Morgan, back here. Look behind you.
I yield.
Thank you. Let me follow up on the Clean Air Act debate. The Clean Air Act debate was part of that provision was that scrubbers were economically feasible at the time. That's the whole difference in this debate. The technology being driven by this administration is not technologically feasible at this time. So we could talk about the Clean Air Act and its provisions all we want, but the whole part of the law that this bill is trying to address is that it has to be available. And it has to be economically feasible because if not, the default is to stop, which is the goal of my friends on the left. I mean, it's not really to have clean burning, low cost energy. It's to shut down fossil fuel use in this country. And that's why this bill is important. That's why this amendment is harmful. And I yield to Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much. I might just also mention that in April 2013, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S., the lowest level since '94. In its 2014 annual energy outlook, the EIA projected that U.S. energy-related carbon dioxide levels will remain more than 7% below their 2005 levels through 2040. In the coming decades, more than two-thirds, 69% of the world's energy-related CO2 emissions will come from non-OECD countries. According to the EIA, non-OECD countries are expected to grow to 120% above 2005 levels. So our legislation does not expect that additional coal plants will be built in America, but it does say that we have the option in the future. If we allow EPA's regulations to stay in effect, you would not be able to build a new coal-powered plant. Last year, Europe took 45% of our coal export because they're building new coal plants because, as I said earlier, natural gas prices are so high. So all this legislation does is, in fact, it affirms what the President has been saying he wants, and that is an all-of-the-above energy policy. Our bill simply allows coal plants to be built in the future if it's determined that they should be built.
I yield back my time to Morgan.
Gentleman yields back his time.
I yield back.
Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's interesting because I represent an industrial area, and I'm concerned about, and I'll fight like everyone else does with EPA when they overreach. One of the reasons is that we have lower emissions is because of the shift over the last few years to natural gas from coal. Although in the last few months, EIA has reported that there's a shift back because natural gas is at $4 per MCF, and you're seeing coal plants being restarted or utilized more. And that was long before we got the $5 gas that we're seeing in the last week or two because of our cold weather. But I'm going to support the amendment. I'm going to thank Mr. Waxman for his efforts to plan forward. In lieu of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, the amendment offers Congress the ability to set the terms and conditions for a federal program that addresses environmental and economic concerns. That's what this Congress should be doing. EPA has judicially been mandated the responsibility to regulate GHGs and has acted due to the lack of the congressional leadership. This committee should assume responsibility and act on GHG regulations and reductions responsibly, knowing everything we know. The European model for cap and trade is just not working. And it's correct. They're building more coal plants. They're shutting down nuclear. And there's no other locations no other cleaner burning. Natural gas is too high, and particularly in Germany and some of the countries, they don't believe in fracking. Additionally, the EIA would independently certify reductions in GHGs from any federal program. The stated purpose of the Energy Information Agency is to collect and analyze and disseminate independent and impartial energy information to promote sound policymaking. Any number of mandates or proposals could be offered, and Congress would tackle GHG emissions, protect the environment, provide ample time for compliance, give certainty to our vital industries. And that's why I think the Waxman Amendment works well with hopefully making Congress take back this authority instead of letting EPA by judicial mandate do this. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are the other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's put this back in context again of we've been dealing with it for the past 3 years, and we've had at this, Mr. Chairman, we've had before us a panel from the EPA, and Lisa Jackson, as an example, has spoken before us and said this technology for new source performance standard, this capture isn't available. It just simply is not available. That's what I think what Mr. Whitfield is trying to point out here. And she said it won't be available for 10 to 15 more years. So as a result of that, if you can grasp that, that means that anyone that wants to build a new energy source in America, and understanding that a lot of the coal-fired powerhouses, this fleet that we have across the country, is aging. So the likelihood of their upgrading and making the improvement based on the technology that can't occur for another 10 or 15 years, it means we're going to switch over more to gas. Now, that's fine. We produce an awful lot of gas in America. But in the meantime, what we have to understand is we have an existing fleet that can provide low-cost energy to this country for manufacturing and jobs. What we're going to be doing, switching, is raising the cost of electricity. We've heard that from some of the speakers that have gone before me on this, that we can do it. We'll just pay more. So people, the seniors, education, everyone, kids, everyone's going to be paying more costs because we have an ideology that we want to switch from coal. Let's just make sure we understand when people attack the coal industry, it's not just the miners that are going to be affected with this. That seems to be an easy thing for people to talk about. We'll just shut down the coal mine. And you can, and you have. But when you shut down a coal mine, it's more than the coal miner. It's the railroad worker that picks up the coal. It's the truckers. It's the timber industry that provides the cribbing. It's someone that makes the belting for all the conveyors. It's the machinist that repairs the equipment and keeps the mine in operation. It's the lubricants that are necessary in a coal mine. All those go away. Then you get into the community. The children don't go to school. They'll move to a different location. You're affecting that education system in that community. You're shutting pharmacies, grocery stores, landlords, all are going to lose the possibility of having people live in that community. Because in many places around America, rural America, the coal mine is the community. Everything is based on that. So this idea of switching for an ideological fight is being promoted here has an impact on the nation's economy. I want people to understand. We can decarbonize America, and that's what I think this effort ultimately is, to decarbonize America. But within 7 years, at the growth rate that other nations are producing CO2 into the atmosphere, we'll be back to the same level between 5 and 6 years from now. We'll be at the same level, and all we've done in America is just cost our jobs. We've put all these people to work, not just coal miners out of work, but all the other industries are going to be affected by it with this kind of legislation that the California congressman is promoting. I think it's got to stop. We've got to let these people have an opportunity. Let me just close with just one thing. If there's one thing that we can take from this meeting, is the amount of CO2 emissions that are coming from coal-fired powerhouses across America. When you take the big scheme of things all across the globe, it only amounts to 0.2% of all the CO2 emitted in the world comes from American coal-fired powerhouses. 0.2%. And we're saying we're willing to put that at risk. We're willing to put those jobs at risk, jeopardizing it for 0.2%. But we also know from Al Gore, Sierra Club, and others that the burning of the tropical rainforest introduced 6 times more CO2 into the atmosphere than the coal-fired powerhouses in America. But we're not addressing that. We're going after places where people work. Children have their job. They have opportunities to have a father or a mother have a job. This is an issue of fairness, and we better be caring about the families and the job creation here in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Time has expired. Gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much with this important markup. And I just wanted to respond to, I guess, a few points made by some of my colleagues today that, it seems that this side of the aisle just wants to get rid of traditional fossil fuel generation across the country. This notion that we can't find a way to do things smarter and cleaner in the United States of America is something that I just can't fathom. It seems that the reason that we have cleaner air today and cleaner water, well, at least cleaner water in most parts of the country, is because of some common sense approaches. And this isn't about a California member of Congress moving forward a policy that's specific to California. This is about a member of the delegation of California who's moving forward some common sense conversations associated with how we can look at things. If we ever imagined that, I guess through science fiction, that we don't need any additional regulatory treatment in these areas, that someday maybe there could be a chemical spill that was used as we talk about coal, that would make its way into an aquifer and flow down a river and make its way into people's wells and come out of a faucet so it smelled so funny that it was people themselves that had to bring this to the attention of the American people and their local governments, as opposed to the company itself coming forward with revelations that they had a major chemical spill in relation to this. But I'm not aware of any hearings that talked about the folks out in the East who couldn't even drink their water, where there's still concerns today that if you happen to be pregnant, that maybe you should stay away from that water. Well, if it's not good for one person, it's not good for anyone. And we're not talking about that. And then let's get to the point about this notion of where the cost of electricity is today. Having sat on a few rate-making cases and previous responsibilities that I had, and you look at the financials that are submitted by utility companies and the generation contracts or the purchase power agreements that come forward, one of the major reasons that the cost of electricity coming from coal generation is so inexpensive today is because those assets are old. They've been depreciated over time. So if you go build a new coal plant today, don't blame it on the regulatory treatment from wanting clean air on the high cost of electricity. It's because the cost of steel has gone up. Those costs of those turbines have gone up. Those conveyor belts the cost of them have gone up. There's more people around the world that are buying these assets. So a new coal plant compared to an old depreciated coal plant is going to cost more. Now, maybe we could do something about looking at those commodities and being a little more forward in our thinking there, but let's face that reality. There's some other areas that it may be science fiction to some, but who would ever thought that we'd come up with something called fluidized bed combustion, advanced pulverized coal combustion. This is one that, I don't know who came up with this, but low NOx burners. Selective catalytic reduction that takes care of a release of an ammonia and a respiratory irritant. Selective non-catalytic reduction. Flue gas desulfurization. Pie-in-the-sky ideas that came out of a regulatory treatment that are used by utility companies today so that what's coming out of those stacks is cleaner. For years, Democrats and Republicans have been able to work on this together, and I would just appeal to the common sense of where even those that are around the states, around the country, that work with an organization called the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, that actually have to implement these rule changes so that when we look at rate making across the country, that we listen to them as well and adopt some of the common sense approaches that have taken place. And especially with the advanced treatment plan, we talk about these comparisons of existing projects that we're looking at across the country. They exist right now. And states, especially on the West, in Oregon and Washington State, not just California, that have moved forward with some of these advancements. So I hope that we just take a pause with how we can move forward in this area. I recently spoke to EEI, to a group of utility experts in that organization, and they asked, why was this down partisan lines? Well, let's find a way to work together, because there's some common sense approaches that we can come together to move this. And so I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, that in the future we're able to find a way of working together again. And I think the first bill that we move forward today is a perfect example of what happens when common sense comes through as opposed to just rhetoric. And I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. The vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Waxman. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, knows that roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. No. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. No. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rodgers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone.
Aye.
Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welsh. Mr. Welsh votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members wishing to go vote, Mr. Walden,
Mr. Walden votes no.
Dr. Murphy.
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Mr. Green, how's Mr. Green recorded? Mr. Green votes aye.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes and 28 nays.
18 ayes, 28 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 3826, offered by Mr. Yarmouth of Kentucky.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve point of order on the amendment.
Point of order is... Oh, sorry. The amendment is considered as read. Sorry. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I and many of my Democratic colleagues have deep concerns about the underlying bill, but this amendment seeks to find a bipartisan way forward that protects the health of our citizens, our environment, and our economy while creating opportunities to partner with the private sector in reducing harmful emissions from new power plants. First, I need to come clean. This actually isn't my idea. This amendment is based on legislation co-authored by former member Rick Boucher and the chairman of this committee, Mr. Upton, and co-sponsored by Mr. Barton, Mr. Whitfield, Mr. Shimkus, Dr. Murphy, and Mr. Terry, all members of this committee. The amendment allows EPA to move forward with reasonable and responsible standards for new power plants, and it establishes a funding stream to assist companies in the deployment of new technologies to reduce carbon pollution and meet those standards. Again, that funding stream is the same one proposed by Chairman Upton and co-sponsored by Republican members of the committee. It assesses a nominal fee on electricity transmission to help fund projects that comply with Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. This fee amounts to just 4/100ths of a penny on each kilowatt hour of electricity delivered from power plants to consumers. And yet, in the aggregate, it would provide $1 billion per year to assist companies in the deployment of critical new pollution control technologies. It's an inventive solution that partners the public and private sector to advance a common goal. It lessens the financial burden of progress and helps us address a leading cause of climate change. And it has a history of strong bipartisan support. Chairman Upton said of his 2008 bill, "This is bipartisan legislation and is evidence that Republicans and Democrats indeed can work together towards common sense solutions to effectively combat climate change." solutions that will both protect jobs and keep energy costs down. My colleague from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, said that bill was, quote, vitally important to the economics and environmental health of this country. And Mr. Barton said, I am a believer in efficiency and technology advance, and if we can use this vehicle to have the United States of America and our private and public institutions develop such technology, it can't be anything but a good thing for the whole community, unquote. I could not agree more. This amendment presents a common sense solution to the bipartisan problem of controlling harmful and dangerous pollution from power plants, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment, Mr. Shimkus is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleague. I think this amendment makes the point that the EPA should not move forward on greenhouse gas regulations because carbon capture and sequestration is not ready for prime time. So I thank my colleague from Kentucky for really reiterating the fact of why we have this bill. The question is, do we have the technology capable today? We didn't have it then. The Senate rejected this provision. We don't have it now. Hence, this bill that we're marking up. You can't force utilities by law to implement technology that is not available. All we're trying to say is follow the law. I know it's hard for this administration to do that, but we would expect the chief executive officer and his cabinet to follow the law. The law says if you're going to move, make sure it's economically feasible for these standards to be in place. Again, my colleague from Kentucky raises this issue. It wasn't then, and it's still not today. I mean, we've had the hearings. We've talked about the Mississippi plant. It's $2 billion over budget. It takes hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies, and it's not even operating yet. So that's where the frustration comes from. If we would just follow the law, we wouldn't be in this position. But the technology is not available. Much like in the clean air debate, the technology was available. A huge difference in the debate. Not available now when it was available then. So appreciate my colleague from Kentucky, and I yield to another colleague from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Shim, because I might just reiterate once again that the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth's amendment, the language that he is in his amendment was basically in the Markey-Waxman bill, which was rejected by a Democratic-controlled United States Senate, and the technology is still not adequately demonstrated, as Mr. Shimkus said, and that's why we have this bill in the first place. So all of the plants that EPA is pointing to set the standards of emission for new plants are receiving huge sums from the federal government. All are cost overruns, significant cost overruns, and none of them are in operation yet, and one of them is in Canada with huge government support as well, all of which, by the way, is a violation of the 2005 Energy Policy Act. So with great respect and admiration for my friend from Louisville, I respectfully oppose his amendment.
And reclaiming my time, I just want to also put on record that those of you who have refineries, they're coming for you next. Carbon dioxide, after coal-fired power plants, they will then come to our refinery sector and say, you pull the CO2 off your stream and you put it underneath the ground. And if you think that's pie in the sky, I feel sorry for you. So if you're a crude oil guy, a natural gas guy, any fossil fuel guy, you better be careful in allowing this administration to shut down the coal sector in this country, because you will be next. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's interesting to listen to this debate. I support the gentleman's amendment. I guess a lot of my friends over on the other side of the aisle, you were for this before you were against it. And you like to say that this didn't pass because of a democratically controlled Senate. But none of you voted for the bill in the House either. So let's put that on the record, too. Now, you did vote for this amendment, however. Many of you did vote for this amendment. And seems to me that if we want to come up with some technology, no one's going to invent the technology if no one has to use it. There's no market incentive for people to develop a technology that doesn't have to be used. What we tried to do in the cap and trade bill, which passed the House, is to provide demonstration projects and the money to fund those demonstration projects so that this technology would become viable, and then there'd be an incentive to build the technology because you would have to use it. Mr. Yarmouth is just putting forth an amendment that many of us on the committee, Democrats and Republicans, supported as part of the Markey-Waxman bill. But let's just, shoot straight here when we're talking about history. None of you members that are blaming all this on the Senate Democrats rejecting the bill voted for the bill either. But I would just like to say I think the gentleman has a good amendment. I supported it in the past, and I'm happy to support it today also.
Gentleman, yield if you...
I'll yield to Mr. Waxman.
Thank you for yielding to me. I feel the passion that some of you are talking about when you're concerned about losing jobs. Your communities have people working in the coal industry, and there's clearly you're transmitting the fear that these people will lose their jobs, and I don't want to see that happen. But we're caught in a predicament because I don't think coal can continue as the major source of power that it has been if it adds to the greenhouse gases. Because we just can't deny that there's a problem of climate change. So the argument we've heard from those trying to protect the coal industry is that technology's not there. Don't force us to use technology that's not there. If you force us to use technology that's not there, and we can't run the business without that technology, the power plants will have to close down. Well, the chicken and egg problem is, how do you get the technology? I believe if you require that the technology be developed, we force the development of new technology by setting the standards. And we don't say how it has to be if the standards are met. That's the way I prefer that we operate in the environmental area. We set the standard and then say to all the industries, figure out a way to accomplish it that will be profitable. And I think this opens up an enormous amount of opportunity for entrepreneurs to figure out the technology. But if we don't force the development of technology by mandating a requirement that the goal be met, the Yarmouth Amendment takes a different approach. His approach is the same approach that was offered to this committee in legislation co-authored by Chairman Upton and former Congressman Rick Boucher. Mr. Boucher, of course, came from the coal area. And rather than require something to be done, require the polluters to pay to make sure that they reduce their pollution, they propose that we provide funding for the development of the technology first by a tax on the utilities that are consumed from coal-burning power plants. And the money then would be used for the development of technology. Now, some people would argue this is paying polluters not to pollute. What I want is the goal of reducing the pollution. I don't want to drive fossil fuels out of business. I think there's going to be a future for fossil fuels, whether it's the refineries or the coal industry. And in fact, unless you get carbon capture and sequestration in place, I think that the coal industry is going to be in greater economic straits. Now, we agreed in the Waxman-Markey bill to include basically the same provision, as well as additional funding. And that financial support would be critical to ensuring coal's future. It would allow coal to compete. It must clean up its carbon pollution, but we would pay for the development of the technology. So I would urge support for the Armith Amendment.
Mr. Upton. Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from, you've had time.
No.
Oh, you did. That's right. I'm sorry. Mr. Whitfield is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, I want to just mention a couple things about the Clean Air Act. We hear frequently about the Clean Air Act provides incentives to produce technology, that it forces technology development. And that's actually true, and I think all of us have benefited from that. But it depends on what part of the Clean Air Act you're talking about. It's true that under Section 108 and 109 of the National Ambient Air Quality Program, EPA does set air quality standards without regard to cost or whether or not it's technically feasible to meet that standard. However, under Section 111, which this greenhouse gas regulation is being adopted to enforce new coal-powered plants, the new Source Performance Standard Program, Congress specifically provided that the standards to be set must be adequately demonstrated and to take into account the cost and other impacts. It specifically says the term standard of performance means a standard for emission of air pollutants which reflects the degree of emission limitation achievable through the application of the best system of emission reduction which the administrator determines has been adequately demonstrated. And we genuinely do not believe that these 4 plants that the administrator is relying on to set the emission standard, they're not even in operation. They all have significant cost overruns. They all rely on enhanced oil recovery and the use of the CO2. So this legislation simply sets a standard, reinforces that it must be adequately demonstrated. And as I've said before, we don't expect that people are going to run out and build new coal-powered plants, but in the future, if prices are so high, by the way, a lot of plants are closing. We already know they're going to close coal plants right now that are running full speed because of this coal spell. And without them, there are 15 states right now that have declared emergency because they don't have enough propane gas. Without these coal plants running right now, there would be significant outages around the country. So all this legislation does is reinforces be adequately demonstrated. And if in the future we want to build a coal power plant, we can, as they are doing in Europe today. Many of you read the New York Times article where Europe, on Wednesday, the European Union proposed an end to binding national targets for renewable energy production, simply because of the economic situation there. And so with that, I would yield to the gentleman from Illinois the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be quick. Just Rick Boucher was a friend of us all. He was a great member of this committee. But the fact that Rick is not here is instructive in this debate. And for those you didn't serve, we all love Rick Boucher. But the fact that he is not here is instructive. And the second point is, we were in the minority. We were doing all we could to try to save coal. All we could. And obviously, that piece of legislation was not going to do anything to save coal or fossil fuels. And I'll just reiterate, this is a similar debate in the refinery sector. The problem is, on existing plants, you can't pull off the carbon dioxide stream. You just can't do it. There's no technology right now to do it, and it's not economic feasible. There's no technology right now to do it off of a refinery. So you may chuckle when we talk about where this heads, but I would talk to anybody in the fossil fuel sector, industry, and they are afraid of the refinery sector going the way of the coal sector, if we don't stop it here. I yield back the time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak? And the gentleman from, gentlelady from Illinois. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this entire bill is premised on the claim that carbon capture and sequestration technology is not available. But this isn't true. The technologies needed for carbon capture and sequestration, CO2 capture, transportation, and storage underground have all been used commercially in the United States for decades. In fact, in the United States, there are already 7 large commercial CCS projects operating today. Another CCS project specifically at a large coal-fired power plant will come online in the United States this year. A coal plant with CCS is also coming online in Canada, and many more CCS systems are operating or under construction in other countries. If you want to buy a CCS system today, there are several engineering companies that will be happy to sell you one. The committee, frankly, the majority, has not bothered to stay abreast of these developments. On June 4th, 2012, Congressman Waxman and Rush requested a hearing so we could examine the status of CCS technology. Unfortunately, the chairman failed to respond to this request, and had the committee held such a hearing, we might all be working off the same set of facts today. Let's hear about these projects, as well as any concerns or questions power plant operators may have. But let's not pretend the technology doesn't exist and can't work. Unfortunately, the chairman of this committee and the Energy and Power Subcommittee have never responded to Mr. Waxman and Mr. Rush's hearing request. I would suggest that we do it now, and that in the meantime, that we pass this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment offered by our colleague from Kentucky. This amendment acknowledges the problem of carbon pollution and carves the path for the future that envisions a role for coal in our energy mix. The technologies available today to capture and sequester carbon can be improved, and the demand for the technologies will drive and hasten the improvements. That effort is worth some public investment because it benefits all of us. This amendment reflects a can-do attitude rather than a can't-do defeatist attitude. We could lead the world in the effort to address this problem. We have the intellectual, entrepreneurial, and financial resources to do this. And so with that, I urge support for the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Just very briefly, I think the debate's been illuminating, and I think there are good points on both sides. Your position on this amendment really depends on, to some extent, on your position on the causes of climate change or global warming, and where you think the state of legislative power is. If it were inevitable that we were going to have some sort of a climate change regulation, this amendment would have enhanced viability on this side of the aisle. But if you believe that we're not, then there's not a real compelling reason to do it. But from a Texas perspective, and there are a number of Texans on this committee, on page 15, this amendment would put ERCOT within the jurisdiction of the FERC, and as the Texans know, ERCOT is an intrastate system wholly within the state of Texas and subject to the Public Utility Commission of Texas, but not subject to FERC regulation. So from a Texas perspective, this would be a no, and I just want my Texans to know that. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Yarmouth. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, noes have it. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Roll call. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall.
No.
Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton.
No.
Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield.
No.
Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Billrakis. Mr. Billrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Aye. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Rush. Miss Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welsh. Mr. Welsh votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton.
Members
votes no.
wishing to cast a vote? Seen none. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 ayes and 30 nays.
16 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Chair would recognize the gentleman from the great state of Michigan.
And we are from the great state, and I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. At the hearing on this bill last year, I agreed with the sponsor that we should provide clarity on EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases. However, as we've seen often in the last 3 years, the legislation before us does nothing to address the underlying problem and instead simply blocks EPA from taking action without providing any alternative solution. Like most members on this committee, I think the Supreme Court came up with a very much erroneous decision on whether the Clean Air Act covers greenhouse gases. Like many of the members of this committee, I was present when we wrote that legislation, and we thought it was clear enough that it did not, that we didn't clarify it, thinking that even the Supreme Court was not stupid enough to make that finding. In any event, my first problem with this legislation is it creates a peculiar and entirely new process for regulations under the Clean Air Act. More complications, more difficulties. The bill would take a long-established and reasonably effective regulatory process and turn it upside down to the great detriment of all those in industry who are seeking certainty. And this is going to screw up almost every industry. The bill would, as a practical matter, eliminate the delegation of rulemaking authority to EPA and set the Congress up as a regulatory agency, something which we tried to do, or rather to avoid doing, when we wrote the Clean Air Act. Traditionally, the Congress and this committee has given the EPA the authority to develop regulations to address particular issues. I'm concerned that we may be setting a disturbing precedent that allows regulations to be set without extensive public comments or technical data from industry and the stakeholders. Traditionally, the Congress has delegated the responsibility to regulate to agencies like EPA. We are denigrating that tradition. Secondly, as we have seen time and time again from this committee, the bill attempts to address an issue without dealing with the underlying law or the underlying problems. What is needed here now is a careful consideration of the Clean Air Act and a proper addressing of the matter. The bill does not amend the Clean Air Act to address the issue. Now, if we want to truly legislate this issue and passing something that can be signed by the President, I think everyone would agree we ought to have more hearings. We ought to incorporate viewpoints from industry as well as the environmentalists. I don't see anything here that's an attempt to compromise or to achieve an honest solution to a very real problem. Once again, we have a bill before us that will pass with virtually no bipartisan support. It's not going to pass the Senate, and it will not be signed by the President. In a word, we are wasting the time of this committee and all the members. Now, I understand this is an election year, but I do believe that we should instead be working to find workable solutions that can make meaningful, beneficial change, not just more partisan talking points. We've got enough of those to last this country for 1,000 years. All too often, I find the radical approaches proposed in the Congress and in this committee over the past few years will do nothing except create more confusion and more problems. This bill, I think, is one of those proposals. Happily, we will be saved by the Senate and the President. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. Gentlelady from Illinois. Gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 3826, offered by Ms. Schakowsky.
The amendment will be considered as read by unanimous consent, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 3 years ago, this committee reported out a bill to block EPA action on climate change, the Upton-Inhofe bill. On the House floor, Ranking Member Waxman offered an amendment to that bill stating that Congress accepts EPA's finding that climate change is occurring, is caused largely by human activities, and poses significant risk for public health and welfare. 237 House Republicans voted against that simple statement of scientific fact. Only one voted for it. And here we are again, 3 years later, considering yet another Republican bill to weaken the Clean Air Act and block EPA from cutting carbon pollution and addressing climate change. The Republicans have remained obstinate in their refusal to take action on climate. But year after year, the science behind climate change has become even more certain. In October, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a new report with urgent warnings. IPCC concluded that warming of the climate system is, quote, unequivocal, unquote, and that the observed changes since the 1950s are, quote, unprecedented over decades to millennia, unquote. Moreover, the evidence showing that humans are the primary driver of this warming has grown since the last IPCC report in 2007. The world's leading scientists now state that with 95% confidence that, quote, human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century, unquote. This is the same level of confidence that scientists have that smoking causes cancer. In November, the United Nations Environmental Program concluded that unless the world significantly reduces carbon pollution by 1920, we will have to rely on more difficult, costlier, and riskier means of keeping the global average temperature from rising to levels beyond which the impacts of climate change could be irreversible and catastrophic. The longer we wait, the more costly it will be to change course. But climate change is recognized as a major challenge beyond the scientific community. Companies such as Coca-Cola and ExxonMobil have recognized the threat of climate change and taken steps to account for it in their business plans. The world's leading executives and economic thinkers who gathered for the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland last week made climate change a central theme of their meetings. It is reckless and irresponsible for this committee to continue to ignore the warnings of the world's best climate scientists and our business leaders. My amendment is simple and lays out the scientific consensus that should be the foundation for any serious legislation to address carbon pollution. My amendment says that Congress accepts the finding that, quote, greenhouse gas pollution threatens the American public's health and welfare by contributing to long-lasting changes in our climate that can have a range of negative effects on human health and the environment, end quote. The potential impacts from climate change are well documented. We could see longer, more intense, and more frequent heat waves. And yes, even cold waves. I know some people have been scoffing the idea that there is warming, but it also leads to unusual climate changes like the kind of cold I'm experiencing in Chicago. More intense precipitation events and storm surges, more prolonged drought in the west and southwest, more fires and insect pest outbreaks in American forests, and more smog, which has been linked to asthma and premature death. I ask my colleagues to acknowledge the science of climate change by supporting my amendment. Denying the science won't make the damaging impacts of climate change any less real or any less costly. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment. I would just say that after the Massachusetts EPA case, EPA did their endangerment finding, they did their tailoring rule, and that's a fact, and they're moving forward now to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. I might add that there is a case in the Supreme Court now because the Massachusetts EPA was based on a mobile emission. They were now moving into stationary emissions, and there is a case before the Supreme Court on that issue right now. But all our legislation does, we're not debating the endangerment finding or the tailoring rule. All our legislation does is try to maintain a reasonable regulatory path to ensure that coal-fired plants can be built in the future, and if the decision is made to do so. And for that reason, I would respectfully oppose the gentlelady's amendment. And I yield to balance my time to the gentleman from Illinois.
And I appreciate my colleague, and sorry for filibustering this debate, but it's very important in rural America and the coal mines and our power plants throughout this country. But for my colleagues to continue to claim there is a scientific consensus, they haven't been reading current writing. In fact, I've been reading a lot from William Happer, who's at Princeton University, Professor Emeritus, Richard Lindzen, Massachusetts Institute of Technology from Cambridge, Roger Cohen, who's a fellow at the American Physical Society. And I'm not going to take the time. I would just encourage my colleagues to do due diligence. And there's a lot of reasons why many of the scientific community wants us to move in this direction, and it is called taxpayers' dollars for research and money. And so I can't leave a charge left unanswered. I would encourage my colleagues to do their own due diligence on the scientific community. I think they'll find a differing point of view, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support the Schakowsky amendment. This amendment simply accepts scientific findings that climate change is real and harmful. And surely we can all agree on these basic facts. I just heard my Republican colleague from Illinois state, do your due diligence, look at the science. And when you do that, it is clear that the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community is that climate change is happening and it's a threat, and we are not doing our jobs here in Congress unless we act to protect the citizens of America and be a leader in the world. My constituents and the citizens of Florida understand these facts all too well. They are already paying for the impacts of the changing climate, having to replace infrastructure in coastal communities, having to pay out of property taxes for mitigation and other preparedness efforts. The rising sea level is an economic and environmental threat in my community, and we fear that with rising tides and rising sea levels that hurricane destruction will become more intense and put infrastructure and lives at risk. And it's not just the citizens of Florida, it's the citizens all across this great country. Every time we have an extreme weather disaster, we're called upon to fund, whether it's emergency management, small businesses getting back on their feet, people who need a helping hand. It is all of us who have to respond. It would be better if we could be proactive and not reactive. It is going to cost us more down the road if we do not address the changing climate in a substantial, scientifically based way. So whether it's NASA or it's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Chemical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the American Medical Association, the American Meteorological Society, American Physical Society, report after report has substantiated what is happening. In fact, just last week, another report from Brown University, the Smithsonian, and the National Academy of Sciences said that the changes are happening faster than expected. We know that sea levels are rising, and we will have greater storm surges, and the damage will be more severe. Another scientific journal just last week, the Geophysical Research Society, issued a report that the mangroves along the east coast of Florida are now trending farther north. What this demonstrates is that the climate is changing. They looked at satellite maps over the past decades, and it's clear that mangroves need a warmer climate to survive. They are now moving from Cocoa Beach up towards St. Augustine and farther north because the scientists said they have not had a hard freeze since 1989. These impacts are going to be very dangerous and costly. Republicans can deny the science, but it won't change the facts, and it won't help the American people. So I urge my colleagues not to bury your heads in the sand. The only way to address this problem is to accept that it's real, get down to work to reduce carbon pollution, and help our communities prepare for the changes before it's too late. So I encourage all of the members of this committee to take the first step. Let's accept the science and recognize the threat of climate change by supporting the Schakowsky Amendment. It's the very least we can do. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you for yielding. You know, time and again, House Republicans have claimed that the science behind climate change is uncertain. These claims are wrong. They're irresponsible and they're dangerous. For decades, the world's scientists have presented policymakers with evidence that climate change is happening and that human activities are responsible. Scientists' warnings have only grown stronger with time. Now, you may find one or two, but recently, based on almost 10,000 peer-reviewed studies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that it is extremely likely that most of the observed increase in the global average temperatures, which are certainly undeniable, since the mid-20th century is due to the rise in man-made greenhouse gas emissions. Our own top scientists have reached the same conclusion. The president of the National Academy of Sciences has explained that scientists are now as certain about human-caused climate change as they are that smoking cigarettes can cause cancer. We're already experiencing climate change. Last week, NOAA reported that 2013 was the fourth hottest year on record. All 10 of the hottest years have occurred since 1998. Sea level is rising, causing coastal flooding and exposing communities to increasing damages from more powerful storms. In the last few years, we've seen some of the strongest storms ever recorded in our country and in others. We have experienced unprecedented droughts and fires as well as devastating floods. Some climate changes are likely already irreversible. And while it's not too late to prevent others, Scientists warn that we must act soon to do so. Our window for action is rapidly closing. With all of the evidence, it's simply wrong to claim that climate change is uncertain, and with all that is at stake, climate change denial is not simply irresponsible, it is dangerous. The American people understand that climate change is occurring, and they want Congress to address it. House Republicans refuse to do so. They continue to deny that there's a problem. They won't even hold hearings to consider the scientific evidence. House Republicans are playing a dangerous game. They are more interested in protecting polluters than they are in protecting the American people. We have a chance at least to state our view that climate change is real in my amendment to this bill, and I urge and I vote. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The other members wishing to speak on the amendment, we're trying to get.
I know.
All right, Mr. Barton is recognized.
I've been biting my tongue, but I'm going to have to say a few things, and I'll. You know, I am not a registered professional engineer at this moment. I haven't kept up my registration, but I was at one time, and I made A's in engineering way back when, in the dark ages of the '60s and the '70s. And you know, to keep hearing this regurgitation that the science is conclusive, and that's just not true. You know, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. E equals MC squared. I mean, there are scientific equations that are true and have been proved over and over again. But to stipulate that man-made CO2 is the cause of, it used to be increased temperature, but now it's just change, so they can have it both ways. That may be somebody's hypothesis. It may be somebody's religious wish, but it is not an absolute scientific fact. Unless the EPA models have changed in the last 2 years. Now, they may have, but the last time I tried to get the EPA to really prove the scientific basis, one, they wouldn't release their data sets. And two, the models at that time could not predict the past within 50% accuracy. Couldn't predict the past. Now, all the models have to simulate world weather patterns, and they do these things called grid matrices. And in every grid matrix, the dominating factor is the amount of not CO2, but H2O in the form of water vapor, which we commonly call clouds. There is no model, unless it's been developed in the last year, that can simulate how a cloud interacts with sunlight coming through the atmosphere and how it impacts temperature below the cloud. They make an estimation and they input it into the model. It is a factor that they determine themselves. In other words, if you want to show the temperature going up, you put something in for clouds and make sure the temperature goes up. It's not an independent variable. It's a determinant driving variable that determines the outcome of the model. Now, even the folks that have a religious conviction in the scientific community that this is something that is a scientific fact, they cannot get the scientific community to say categorically it's a fact. The gentlelady from Illinois read correctly the latest IPCC observation, which is that I think she said something like extremely possible or something like that. Likely. Okay. Maybe it is likely. We know the climate is changing. Much of the energy that we use today from natural gas and oil was deposited in the form of sedimentation millions and millions of years ago when the average CO2 level was over 3,000 parts per million. We're now a little below 400. About, in the 1500s and 1600s, the CO2 levels, we think, because of what we've looked in the ice blocks and the pine tree rings and things like that, was about 250 parts per million. And it was called the Little Ice Age. the little ice age. So, you know, I understand a lot of people really, really, really want to believe that man-made CO2 is some demon. But man-made CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases do affect the climate and do affect temperature. But to make the determination that the amount of man-made CO2 in the atmosphere, which has gone, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up about 50 parts per million in the last 50 years, I think, is making all these cataclysmic changes, that is not a scientific fact. And with that, Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
I yield
Chairman,
back.
would you yield for a question?
I'll yield, if it's a nice question.
It is likely that Al Gore got rich making speeches about this, and it is likely that the American people have paid $34 billion to $40 billion for nothing.
That's not a question.
Yield back.
That's a comment, not a question. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman. I support the Schakowsky Amendment because I think it makes common sense to acknowledge the scientific evidence that is out there. And the evidence is everywhere. It's not just coming from the scientific community. It's what people can see with their own eyes. The increase in violent weather that Americans are experiencing and the cost and the burden of that is being felt in communities across the country. I am convinced, I believe that the evidence is conclusive that there is climate change and that we are contributing to that climate change. But even if you were somebody who wasn't absolutely convinced conclusively that this was the case, prudence would dictate, based on what we're seeing and on the information we have, that we take some action when it comes to public policy. The evidence is available to see in many places. 2 weeks ago, the Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change heard from Alaskan natives from a village of Shishmaref off the coast of Alaska. Now, this is anecdotal evidence, but it's also backed up by scientific research. The island they live on has been held together by permafrost and protected by sea ice for centuries, but that's melting. And as a result, their island is being washed away through rapid erosion. The villagers reported that they can lose 20 feet of land in 1 hour during a storm. Houses are left hanging over cliffs above the ocean, roads and infrastructure disappear, and the entire community has decided it has no choice but to relocate. And there's dozens of villages that are experiencing the same imminent threat and may be forced to abandon their homes. In my state of Maryland, we're beginning to see erosion along the Chesapeake Bay, which is attributable to the change in the climate and the weather events that we're having. When the effects of carbon pollution are forcing whole communities to relocate, as I just reported is happening in Alaska, there should be no question that climate change is happening and endangers the welfare of Americans. For some reason, some members of this committee continue to deny that climate... Actually, I take it back. Representative Barton just said, acknowledge that climate change is happening, which is an important step. He just doesn't want to concede that the activities of humans are contributing to that, which is what the scientific evidence points to. And this denial of the science is occurring on the part of members who represent areas that have been very hard hit by extreme drought or unprecedented floods or massive wildfires, etc. And these members continue to vote in spite of that as if nothing unusual is happening. So we're going to have these disagreements over policy. That's fine. But there shouldn't be a disagreement about the basic facts and the science. That's fundamentally, as Ms. Schakowsky said a moment ago, it's irresponsible when it comes to representing our constituents, and it's dangerous. The Schakowsky Amendment does not affect the substantive provisions of this bill. A vote against the amendment is really a vote to deny the science. If you believe that climate change is a problem, you should vote for the amendment and support it. Only those who believe climate change is a global hoax and will have no negative effects should oppose this amendment. So I encourage my colleagues to support it and to acknowledge the science, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would just like to say we're trying to navigate this to try to finish not too much longer, maybe 15, 20 minutes more if we can. So if there are no other members wishing to speak on this amendment, the vote will occur on the amendment. Those in favor of the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I'd like a roll call vote.
Roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Ms. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members wishing to vote, Mr. Pompeo.
Mr. Pompeo votes no.
Mr. Walden.
Mr. Walden votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seen none. Mr. Scalise.
Mr. Scalise votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seen none. The clerk will report the tally. How is Mr. Waxman recorded?
Mr. Waxman votes aye.
Waxman votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 24 nays.
20 ayes and 24 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps. Generally, the clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Which number is your amendment, ma'am?
Number 4.
Amendment to H.R. 3826 offered by Mrs. Capps.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the amendment will be distributed, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Whitfield bill is about denial. It's about denial of climate change. It's about denial of the existence of technologies that could help solve the climate problem. My amendment is intended to correct just one of the bill's many problems, a bizarre provision that would require the EPA to ignore pollution control technologies being used abroad when it sets new power plant standards for the United States. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA must determine the best system of emission reductions for new coal-fired power plants, and it must set standards based on its best technology. But under the bill, EPA would be blocked from considering pollution controls used outside of the United States, even if such systems are readily available and proven abroad. The law would require EPA to pretend that such technologies simply don't exist. For example, the most efficient steam boilers used to generate electricity in conventional coal power plants are ultra-supercritical boilers. These ultra-supercritical coal plants use less coal to generate electricity, which helps reduce carbon pollution, among other benefits. Today, there are ultra-supercritical coal plants in countries around the world. China is the world leader, having installed more than 100 of these supercritical units. But in the United States, there is only one ultra-supercritical coal plant. Under the Whitfield bill, the ultra-supercritical plants in other countries wouldn't count, and one plant in the U.S. would be insufficient for EPA to require utilities to install even just this more efficient boiler technology at new conventional coal-fired plants. As the rest of the world moves forward, the Whitfield bill would just keep America power plants and pollution controls stuck in the past. EPA has proposed to set standards for new coal-fired power plants that would achieve greater carbon pollution reductions through the use of carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS. If the world is to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, and if coal is to help us get there, then CCS is exactly the kind of technology that we need. And yet, just as the Whitfield bill would block EPA from requiring ultra-supercritical boilers, the bill would also block EPA's proposed CCS standards and create hurdles to ensure that the EPA can never establish carbon pollution standards for coal-fired power plants in this country. EPA and others provided evidence to the Energy and Power Subcommittee that CCS is both feasible and available, and that coal-fired power plants with CCS are moving forward. Some of these projects are in the U.S., and some of them are being pursued abroad. One important CCS project is a coal-fired plant in Canada, which is scheduled to come online this year. Surely the bill's proponents can agree with me that technologies being installed and used in other countries, including our neighbor to the north, these should provide evidence that such technologies exist and could be used here too. My amendment would simply remove the Whitfield bill's ban on EPA considering pollution control technologies used in other countries when setting pollution control standards. This amendment won't make this a sensible or reasonable bill, and it won't make the bill something I could support. But at least this amendment would avoid having the U.S. Congress require a science-based agency to pretend that technology operating in other countries simply doesn't exist. So I ask my colleagues to at least support this simple and sensible change. And I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote, the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment by our colleague from California. The United States has been the world's leader in research and development of technology now for decades, but we didn't attain that position by ignoring the rest of the world. R&D is an inclusive, open process. It looks for innovative ideas wherever they emerge. As written, this bill damages R&D in multiple ways. It ignores current technologies in use, denies the regulatory push needed to improve carbon pollution abatement technologies, and it discounts the demonstration and deployment experience of other nations. This amendment will not correct the many flaws of this legislation, but it would be an improvement to the current bill. And with that, I urge support of it and yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I make one comment?
Gentleman from Kentucky.
I rise in opposition to the amendment simply because the amendment is not necessary, because the EPA already is looking at technology in Canada. As I stated before, they set these emission standards based on 4 plants, none of which are in operation. One of them is in Canada. It's $115 million over budget. And once again, none of them is technology that has been adequately demonstrated. And so
Gentleman yield.
Despite the lady's best intentions, the EPA is already referring to a technology developed in Canada. So I don't think that this is necessary. And I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from California.
As I understand it, the bill prohibits looking at technology to be feasible if it were developed overseas, if it were developed outside the country. So this amendment would say if it's in Canada or any other country, you can use that to decide the question of whether the technology has been adequately demonstrated. And then there's another amendment, and maybe you could accept these amendments. The other amendment is that in doing this determination, there's in the bill, you can't look at any technology that's been developed by taxpayers' money, and that doesn't make sense at all. So I'd like to suggest that what you're saying isn't what we read in the bill, and maybe if you accepted the amendment, it would read the way you intended it.
Well, thank you very much for raising that issue. And, you know, I wouldn't mind accepting this amendment. Will you vote for the bill if we did?
I'm just trying to improve your bill, but it's not improved enough. But
Okay.
It seems to me that if you really want to say no EPA action unless there's technology already demonstrated, why restrict that determination to only technology developed in the United States and ignore if it's developed elsewhere, or developed in the United States but not with taxpayers' dollars? Why those restrictions?
Well, you know, if we report this bill out today, I would really be happy to sit down with you all and talk about an amendment on the floor if we get the floor.
Why not do it now?
Well, I need to. You've surprised me, and I need to think about it for a minute. Like I said, they're already using outside in Canada technology and setting their emission standard. But I'd be happy to talk about it if we can get this bill to the floor and Ms. Capps sit down with you and Mr. Yeah. Thank you.
If she wants to hold back, otherwise, I think she's offered a good amendment.
Mr. Chairman, but I'm happy to pursue conversation about it.
The other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. The vote occurs on the Capps amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. And opinion of the chair, noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bill Rockus. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Miss Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Dr. Gingrey?
Dr. Gingrey is not recorded. Mr. Gingrey votes no.
Ms. Blackburn?
Mrs. Blackburn votes no.
Mr. Scalise?
Mr. Scalise votes no.
Mr. Walden?
Mr. Walden votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes and 26 nays.
18 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? The gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3826, offered by Mr. McNerney.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of our members are leaving to get their gloves and mittens, so I'll try to be brief here. My amendment strikes the provisions of this bill that would prohibit the EPA from considering results of taxpayer-funded demonstration projects when setting pollution control standards for new coal-fired power plants. In demonstration projects, the Department of Energy and other agencies partner with private companies to develop new pollution control technologies, and in these cases, taxpayer dollars are spent with the express purpose of improving air quality for the American people. H.R. 3826 would force the EPA to ignore the technologies developed during these demonstration projects when the agency sets pollution control standards. When public investment leads to technologies that can reduce emissions and improve public health, Americans should be able to benefit from those technologies. That's the reason we invest in them. The bipartisan omnibus appropriations bill that Congress just passed invests almost $400 million of public money for carbon capture and sequestration technologies at coal-fired power plants, including demonstration projects. We should not ignore the investments, as H.R. 3826 would do. Many demonstration projects are full-scale commercial endeavors, including a 582-megawatt coal-fired power plant in Mississippi. That plant will cut carbon dioxide pollution by using carbon capture and sequestration and will begin selling electricity on the grid later this year. The public should be able to benefit from federal investments rather than having them ignored. Now, in addition to that, I firmly believe that developing and implementing CCS technology ultimately will benefit the coal industry. Climate change is progressing, starting with a historic superstorm or two here, an unprecedented mega drought there or two, as we're having in California now. This is just the beginning. As things get worse, the public will clamor for action. If CCS is not in place, coal-fired power plants will be forced to shut down. Instead of going down that path, let's develop and implement CCS now so the technology is in its place. If you want to protect the coal-related jobs, then you should support CCS technology. Development of CCS technology will help the industry as our nation continues to reduce carbon emissions. We need to follow these successes and allow innovation to continue from a science-based perspective. I hope my colleagues can support this amendment, which allows the EPA to continue considering clean coal technologies developed at publicly supported demonstration projects. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Whitfield.
I would just rise respectfully to oppose the amendment. The fact is that EPA has already set the emission standard based on 4 projects, all of which receive significant public funds. And without those public funds, none of these projects would have been built. The Kemper plant is $5 billion cost overruns already. The Summit plant in Texas, on January 6th, the utility that had contracted to purchase the project's power announced it was going to allow the purchase agreement to expire. The California plant is still being planned, still in the permitting process. They've not even dug a first shovel of dirt. The Canadian plant is $115 million over budget, a very small 110 megawatt plant. And they're setting the standards for new coal plants based on these projects, none of which are in operation, all of which have significant cost overruns, none of which would have been built without government funds. So the gentleman seems to be, with his amendment, trying to reverse the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which expressly prohibited EPA from using plants that are using federal dollars in demonstration projects to set emission standards under 111D. So I think the amendment really is too late. And while I have great respect for the gentleman from California, I would respectfully oppose the amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment by our colleague, Mr. McNerney. This amendment also corrects language in this bill that discounts and denies the value of federal research and development. We have approved funding for these projects for years in the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. If there's no value to them, why do they continue to receive support from many of the same people who support this legislation? Federal R&D and demonstration projects do have value and should be considered. These projects are done in partnership with our private sector, and presumably so the technology will someday be used to our benefit. The amendment is pro-R&D and recognizes this important path for technology improvement, and so I urge support for its adoption, and with that, I yield back.
Do you yield back? Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. McNerney. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, no, noes have it. Noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3826 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The ayes have it. Roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Aye. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Barton. Aye. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bill Rackus. Mr. Bill Rackus votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Waxman.
Except for this one guy who
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone.
No.
Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Miss Eshoo. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Castor.
No.
Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes.
No.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney.
No.
Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welsh. Mr. Welsh. Mr. Welsh votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes
Other
aye.
members wishing to vote? Mr. Butterfield.
Mr. Butterfield votes no.
Mr. Gardner.
Mr. Gardner votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, clerk will report the tally. Oh, Ms. Kathy McMorris Rogers votes aye.
Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye.
We're done.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 29 ayes and 19 nays.
29 ayes, 19 nays. The ayes have it. The bill, H.R. 3826, is favorably reported. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill as reported by the committee today. So ordered. Mr. Dingle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not object. This is just
Correct. We'll make sure that we'll make sure that they'll have more than 2 days to get it done. So ordered. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.